I think peace requires organization, it requires commitment, it requires skill, and it requires public mobilization as well. And I think that was understood by people left and right in many different countries in the 50s and 60s. And I think that's what we have to think about again in thinking about the future of the UN.
Hello, you're listening to The Next Page, a podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. I'm Amy Smith, and we're honoured to end our 2025 series with an episode about the former UN Secretary General U Thant. I have with me here online Dr. Thant Myint U. He is a writer, historian, conservationist, and international public servant. He's an honorary fellow of Trinity College at the University of Cambridge, where he teaches international history. And he has recently published his latest book, Peacemaker, U Thant and the Forgotten Quest of a Just World. Thant Myint U is also senior advisor to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. He previously served at the UN Secretariat in New York, as well as on 3 United Nations peacekeeping operations in Cambodia and the former Yugoslavia. He's also the grandson of U Thant. The book is such a moving story to read, and it brings out so many deeper themes as well. I was wondering, what did writing the book mean to you?
It was really an exploration in the beginning, because I didn't set out to write his biography or part of his biography. I was actually meaning, when I set out to work on a new book project, of working on something entirely different. It was going to be about 18th century East India Company in Asia. But it was in the evenings after I'd come back from the British Library that I was increasingly drawn to the UN website and the archives, and started looking at documents that had been digitized over the past few years. And as I looked at them, and I'd never seen them before, both the official archive and also his private papers, which had been digitized as well, I began to feel that there was a story that had never been told. I knew the broad outlines of his life, but I didn't really have a sense of exactly what motivated him over those 10 years, how all these different episodes, from the Cuban Missile Crisis through Vietnam to the Six-Day War, how they related to each other and how they related to what I knew about him in terms of his personal life and his background in Burma. So it was an exploration, and it was trying to solve many different mysteries as well. So I had to check with the American archives, the UK archives, other things. I spent a lot of time trying to unravel exactly what happened and then pull it together into a story that I hope would be interesting to people and to readers.
Well, it certainly is. And it sounds like, and you mentioned this right at the end of the book, that his name was almost airbrushed out of history. And in some ways, like you said, this putting it all back together must have been really quite an exploration. So U Thant became the first non-European Secretary General and led the organization through some of the most turbulent crises of the Cold War. And you've mentioned some of them, the Cuban Missile Crisis, notably. He left university early with a teaching certificate, and his aim with that was to support his family. And he rose and soon became head teacher at the National High School in his hometown. And you describe in the book his moral compass as being grounded in Buddhist humanism. How does his background and the values he held shape the way he approached global leadership?
I think his Buddhism was always important in terms of, what it meant to him in terms of guiding his relationships. I think he was keen to, he wanted to believe that he was a practitioner of Buddhism. So I think that shaped his temperament as well. I think I mentioned in the book this one American journalist who knew Hammarskjöld as well, and she said, one was literally electrified in his presence. Hammarskjöld had this electrifying personality, but within that, you went into the room and immediately sort of calmed down and relaxed and felt that almost anything was possible in terms of compromise. So I think that came out of a certain Buddhist practice that he valued a lot. I think his Burma background and being in that small town was a mix of things. I mean, it was a very multicultural world. There were people from India, from China, British influence as well. But I think something else, which was he was an incredibly sociable person. And I think that sociability, that that sort of extrovert personality really flourished when he was a teacher. I think he hosted lots of different events. And so I think that part of his personality was developed in that way as well. I guess a mystery for me, even now, is this question of why he, even as a very young child, when he was 9, 10 years old, had this fascination for the rest of the world. I mean, why he alone in his school tried to master English and then read stories to the other boys. Why he was so interested in being this bridge between like different cultures and between Burma and the West. And something, as a young boy in a small town, that was a special thing. And I'm not exactly sure where that came from.
Yes, it's interesting idea to look at how does this sort of love of humanity and concern for humanity, how is it instilled in us and how does it develop? Did you find any sort of answer to that?
Not really. I mean, I guess I can only imagine that. I mean, it must have been partly his teachers in his school, maybe also the encouragement he might have had from some of his professors at university, even people like J.S. Furnival, who became a very eminent sociologist in Cambridge afterwards, was his history professor at Rangoon University, but also perhaps his father, who was quite cosmopolitan in a way. He was educated in Calcutta and had this amazing library for a small town of English books. And then the books themselves. Then I think just having this library of Victorian, Edwardian books from the 19th, early 20th century, and then immersing himself in those books, as well as in Burmese literature. Maybe it was that mix that also molded him at an early age.
Yes, I think you mentioned Lorna Doone in the book. Yes, I remember reading that when I was young,
That's right.
and it's quite surprised me that someone in Burma would have been reading that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it's reading those things which are set in such a different culture and then having all around you physically a different culture and constantly having your imagination going from one to the other. I mean, that's not unique to him. That happens to lots of people, but I think it was an element in him being and wanting to be this kind of bridge between two different worlds as well.
Hmm. So let's go back a bit more to his time as Secretary General, and we've mentioned some of the crises that he faced or the world faced at the time. Would you perhaps walk us through his role in one or two of them, and really to show how his style of diplomacy contrasted with that of his contemporaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a couple of things. I mean, one is, with the Congo, which was the first crisis that he faced. And I think he brought into that conflict, and this is, just after Dag Hammarskjöld had been killed, he had just become Secretary General or acting Secretary General. The UN had 22,000 plus troops in the Congo. And there was this Katanga secession that was being backed by Belgium and Belgian mercenaries. And I think for the non-aligned countries, but especially for the Afro-Asian countries, the countries from Africa and Asia that had just become independent, the Congo was this incredibly important test, not of ending a civil war in the Congo, but of rejecting foreign intervention and ending foreign intervention and making sure that not just for the Congo, but in general, that independence from European empires really meant independence and not just a kind of continuation of European rule or interference by other means. And so I think he took that feeling with him into the Secretary General's office. And he immediately, within the first few days in office, took a far more tough line than Hammarskjöld had in dealing with the Katanga crisis. And so over the coming year and a half or so, he tried diplomacy in ways, but in the back of his mind was always this desire also to use overwhelming force in the end to crush the Katanga secession, and he did. And in a way, it's kind of counterintuitive, right? One thinks of both the UN Secretary General, and U Thant in particular, someone who's always seeking a peaceful solution. But I think on matters around national sovereignty and the protection of national sovereignty, especially in that very delicate post-colonial moment, I think he really didn't hesitate to use force to make sure that the outcome that he felt was necessary for the UN materialized. So I think that was one, and perhaps one that's maybe surprising to people. Maybe just another I would mention is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where, I mean, my book goes into, I think, what is quite an exciting story of those few weeks. But there it was, without any mandate from the Security Council, without any mandate from the General Assembly, he intervened in the crisis at the height of the crisis, and both through a series of private as well as very public messages to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and the American leader John F. Kennedy, I think tried to create the space and the time that both sides, he felt, would need to find a diplomatic solution. So I think he felt that his role was partly to put forward formula for a settlement, which he did. It was partly to fly down to Havana to make sure that Fidel Castro at the right time was on board. But more than anything else, it was to provide the Secretary Generalship as a neutral point of reference that would allow both sides to find a way back or to take a step back from the nuclear brink. And maybe lastly, just to mention Vietnam, where there was a whole series of attempts at secret diplomacy, more or less, which didn't work. But I think what did work and what led him in a slightly different direction was to use his position as Secretary General to provide, after discussions with leaders from around the world, North, South, East, and West, what was a neutral analysis of what the war was really all about. And to provide that analysis, to provide a different interpretation from the interpretation that people were hearing from Washington and in the media in the US, and outline really practical first steps towards possible negotiated solution to the war.
You've just said the word practical, and that seems to come out quite a lot in the book, a very practical approach to things. How successful do you feel he was as a peacemaker? Particularly as you're talking about this way of bringing neutrality and a space for people to be able to talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to, go back to that period where, for different, we had the UN that was already 14, 15 years old, and it was set up after two horrible world wars and a Great Depression in between, and a commitment by many people from many different countries that they would never allow that to happen again, and a different kind of global politics was necessary. But 10, 15 years later, the world was descending into not just a Cold War, but the real possibility of nuclear confrontation. And I think the task was really how to refit or retrofit the UN in a way that was up to that historical moment, that it was going to be maybe not what was intended in 1945, which was the great powers acting together to prevent aggression, but actually this new role centered as much in the Secretary Generalship as in the Security Council about trying to find, again, practical ways to not just avert nuclear tension, nuclear war, but de-escalate tensions more generally between the big powers. So I think that was a central thing that he had to try to do, especially in the early years of his Secretary Generalship.
I was also wondering, the way that he worked with his closest staff. There was Ralph Bunche, there was Narasimhan, there was Brian Urquhart, and others. What was it like in that working atmosphere in the office? Because we're not just talking about one Secretary General, one man who was doing all of this.
Yeah. I think it was a mix. So I don't think he was particularly a good manager in the sense that I don't think he concerned himself very much with management issues in the sense of personnel issues or budgetary issues or financial issues in the way that Hammarskjöld, for instance, had. Hammarskjöld spent a couple of his first years really focused on trying to reform the UN and stand up the international civil service. I don't think Thant was very concerned with that, or at least that wasn't a primary focus. And he delegated all of those kinds of issues to top aides like C.V. Narasimhan, for example. At the same time, I think he really valued his relationship with these top aides. I think he trusted them. I think he chose men who he felt were loyal to the organization and who shared a certain temperament as well, an approach to world affairs. And I think it was a couple of things. One is, I think he cared a lot about the people around him. So I found many notes, for example, not just to people like Ralph Bunche when he was in the hospital, but to Ralph Bunche's secretary when she was in the hospital as well. So I think everyone on 38th floor, everyone he met, the security guards, everyone, I think he really cared about as human beings. And I've seen that in lots of different private papers and notes in his archive. I think with his top staff, I mean, he saw them all the time. And so, lunches, working lunches were always with top staff as well as with perm reps and with others. But I think his closest personal relationships were probably just with Ralph Bunche and Narsingh, his two main aides. And they were all, men of a certain generation. There were very few women in UN circles, though he was close to a few women as well in those circles, like Agda Rosell, who was the Swedish perm rep in the late 50s and early 60s, the first woman ambassador to the UN, and he really valued her consul. But all of these people were people who, again, in their adult life had witnessed 2 world wars and were really committed to trying to make something else work, not just as an abstraction or an ideal or something to advocate, but as a practical mechanism, an actual place where compromises were going to be struck and peace was made in very different ways.
Yeah. You've mentioned practical again. And I remember you saying when you spoke fairly recent in Geneva about your book that you mentioned that your grandfather had only, of the 10 years that he was Secretary General, took 1 day of leave during that time. So it really was a very intense
period. Yeah. I think it was, it was more than one, but it was a few days, but still not very much. And I think it was a choice. It wasn't that he was desperate to, go on holiday and he couldn't. I think there was an element of that because even when his son died, for example, he felt he couldn't take the time away to go to his son's funeral in Burma. And I think that death kind of left a psychological cloud over the remaining many years of his time at the UN. But I think he also enjoyed his work tremendously. And one time when the doctor ordered him to go on holiday, to go to the Caribbean, and he went to the beach in St. John, I think, in the American Virgin Islands for a few days, he said that he was bored after a couple of days. And so I think there was an element that he wanted to work and he enjoyed what he was doing tremendously as well. But yes, I mean, he was incredibly, not just a hard worker, but I think he was very methodical in his work. I've seen, in his papers before his press conferences, for example, when they were ad hoc kind of remarks that he would make to the press and answer lots of different questions. I mean, lots of, pages and pages of handwritten notes of things that he might say and issues that he would go over on every single conflict in the world and every single issue before the UN. So I think he was quite, diligent in terms of the way in which he approached his job as well.
Yeah, very, yes, this diligence, but also he spoke of striving for a just world. What did he mean about that? And how did this vision of a just world really connect with these broader movements of decolonization, demands for equity in the global order?
I think it was finding for him, maybe it's balance is not the right word, but the connection between two things. One is, on the one hand, I think he placed front and center not just the basic purposes and principles of the UN Charter, but this added element of a commitment to decolonization, which came late in the first couple of decades of the UN's existence. So by the late 1950s, with these newly decolonized countries coming to the UN, finishing decolonization, making it a real thing, and making sure that a system, and a new international system where all sovereign states were treated equally was at the center. I think that was really important to him, and that was that in his time in office, that stretched from the Congo crisis at the very beginning all through the very end of many different efforts in the Middle East and Africa and elsewhere as well. His huge commitment to the liberation struggles in Southern Africa, I think he would see as a really important aspect of trying to forge a more just world. But I think it was trying to connect that agenda, that decolonization agenda, that creation of a new international system, the UN as a universal body, with something else, which was, I think he wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a third world agenda, but was really universal. And I think, again, that self-conception of himself as a bridge between what we would now call the global south and the global north, I think was also really important to him. And so I think the struggles for justice in the global north as well, including, for example, civil rights movement in America and his active encouragement to his deputy, Ralph Bunche, to remain active in the civil rights movement in America. So it was Ralph Bunche, as UN Undersecretary General, with a UN flag behind him, marching at Selma, Alabama with Martin Luther King, for example. So I think men like U Thant and Ralph Bunche saw the connectedness of all of these different things and really wanted to be part of a genuine global movement and not just that original sort of third world or decolonization movement from which U Thant came.
It was really quite visionary. What do you think we can learn from that today?
I don't know. I mean, I think, to be honest, in some ways we're in a obviously different world in terms of technology and everything else. I think that the problem, and we're not in a worse world. I mean, in many ways, the world is much better in terms of living standards and everything else, and hundreds of millions of billions of people having been pulled out of poverty over the past few decades. And we go back to the 60s and we see terrible wars and tensions and possible nuclear holocaust in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we're not in a worse situation in that way. I think the problem, though, is that then we were that much closer to World War II. And I think there was more fear of another great war. And I think we've lost a little bit that energy that came from that fear and a willingness to try to invest in the UN. I think a lot of that energy and public awareness has faded away. So I think that vision of the need for a different kind of global politics, so we don't go back to, or we don't sleepwalk back into the kinds of things that led to 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century, is as important as ever. But we're lacking, I think, some aspects of the fear and as well as the hope that we had in the 60s for something different.
I'm glad you've mentioned hope, and that it's not just driven by fear, but yeah, absolutely. You wrote an article in The Economist in June earlier this year and called for a refocusing of the UN on preventing war and a move, and I quote, towards a new generation of peace diplomacy, integrating global economic as well as political thinking. I was wondering how writing this biography of your grandfather had shaped your own perspective on international relations and the possibilities for peace.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about a couple of different things. I mean, one is it really taught me a lot about the actual art of diplomacy and the kinds of ways in which UN mediation worked in the past in the 1960s and lessons from that are still applicable today in many different ways. And I think people who read the book will see from all these different examples, successes as well as failures, that there are many different ways in which the Secretary General, for example, or members of his team without any mandate from Security Council or General Assembly can try to identify through creative diplomacy ways ahead in seemingly intractable conflicts. But I think, again, the situation today is different than what it was before because of, when you read the book, time seems to be a very different element then as well. The ability of U Thant, for instance, to fly off to India and Pakistan, spend 10 days with the leaders in both countries, without any phone, without any distraction from other conflicts, without the pressures of social media. I'm not sure if that kind of diplomacy can really be fully recovered in a way. I think one thing I did learn was something about the arc of the UN story more generally. And I'd never really thought about that before. I don't write about it in the book because it's something that I've kind of thought about more since writing the book. So in my mind, in a way, you have that original UN, the UN that was conceived by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as this quite muscular enforcement collective security mechanism that was agreed with Stalin and with Churchill, that never really materialized. And then there was an attempt to do that in the late 40s and 50s, but with the Cold War, it was impossible. Then this sort of second UN, and I think that was begun under Hammarskjöld, and then in terms of diplomacy, probably reached a peak in the 60s and early 70s and in my grandfather's time, and continued in some ways, even under Pérez de Cuellar in the 80s, with many successes in terms of peace settlements. And that was a UN that was very much shaped by the decolonization movement and the values that came from the third world. And then I think it's the UN that we're perhaps most familiar with, which emerged from the mid-90s onwards, especially under Kofi Annan, which was a UN that was really framed around that US unipolar moment and a period of US supremacy, and in many ways was an adjunct to aspects of that liberal world order that emerged in the 1990s. And so I guess what I'm saying is, I think in writing the book and thinking about it, I thought a lot about that broader arc of the UN story as well.
Hmm. Really very, very interesting. And I hope this arc continues and
Yeah,
moves on.
I think in a way, if what I mentioned, if we use that as a frame, that was UN 1, 2, and 3, and I think we're sort of waiting for the fourth iteration of the UN, and it's not about rescuing UN 3 or going back to UN 1 or 2. It's about thinking about where we are in the world now, and also global public opinion and what young people think, and new technology and everything else, and thinking what that how we can imagine a different UN going forward. I don't think we have the answer to that, because I feel like a little bit like in the early 50s, a little bit like in other periods, we're sort of in a transition period where we're not really sure exactly how we connect global power to some of the aspirations in the UN Charter and elsewhere as well.
It's wonderful. We can see it emerging. Let's see what form that takes. Thinking more about the process of writing the book and so on, there are a lot of family recollections in it and stories, and of course you brought up the heartbreaking time of losing his son, but it's also mixed with all the global history and world history and so on. Was it difficult to find that balance of?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think finding the balance between his professional life and his personal life wasn't too difficult. I mean, I don't have an endless number of sources and things. And so, especially on his personal life, he didn't leave behind. Well, there were lots of records in the archive as well. But again, it wasn't difficult to find that balance. It was more about telling the story in a way that was very much focused on him as Secretary General, but then included all these elements from his personal life as well. I think a little bit more difficult for me was trying to make sure that I was objective as a relative, as he was my ancestor. And at some points I found myself sometimes being too critical, like always looking for the mistakes he might have made, and then sometimes reversing course and then feeling maybe I've gone too far in the other direction and not looking enough for the failures around Vietnam or the failures around Biafra or some other conflicts. It was always trying to go back and forth in that, in really, grounding my story in the evidence and in the archives, but still trying to tell an interesting story from a human perspective as well.
So talking about the stories and so on, you've done so many interviews and written so many articles and so on, but I just wondered if there was something that you'd found in your research that you didn't include in the book or haven't talked that much about, and that you could share with us today?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my original manuscript was probably at least a third longer than the book. So there was a lot there that I didn't use, because in the end, you want to have a lean story that's not too long. There's a lot more on the UFOs, for example. He was really obsessed with UFOs. That was there. One part that came late to my kind of knowledge and attention that I only not mention, I do more than mention in passing, but don't really focus on, is the importance of Southern Africa and his feelings around apartheid in South Africa and the UN's work in supporting liberation movements in Southern Africa as well. So there was a lot there. But in terms of specific stories, I don't know, there's still things in the archive, that haven't been declassified. And there were still leads that I was trying to follow, but wasn't able to get a hold of personnel records of people. One mysterious person who I had to cut out of my book entirely because I wasn't really sure how to fit him in, is someone named Donald Thomas. And Donald Thomas was both Hammarskjöld and U Thant's bagman. He was the person who traveled with Secretary General all the time, was the bodyguard, was the driver, was always with them, even though he was an American, in the Kremlin, in Havana with U Thant, for example. And there's nothing about him anywhere on the internet, no obituary. So I really wanted to know more about this person who was with my grandfather, almost every waking moment, except for a couple of hours at home. And yet that's missing from the record.
So there's more to be written, more to be found. Wonderful.
Yeah, there are some other mysteries. I mean, I mentioned, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, when he was coming under tremendous attack in the media, there was a front page story in the New York Times that was based around a completely fictitious memo. So who placed that memo, and how did it make its way to the front page of the New York Times, for example? And there are lots of mysteries like that I haven't fully resolved.
I hope you will work on that later. I'd love us to close with the opening scene of your book, the farewell tribute lunch at the Pierre Hotel in New York, when he stepped down from the role of Secretary General. And at the end of his speech, John Lennon, of course, proposed to play a little song he'd just composed, and it's called Imagine. You recreate the feeling of the event so well in the book, and I just wondered if you would say a few words about that again to describe the crowd who was there, the ambiance, all of that, and especially the main point to U Thant's farewell speech.
I think, I started with the book in a way because it is a microcosm of a different era. And in a way, it was almost the moment of passing of that era. It had reached a kind of peak and would diminish. And it's hard to imagine today. So it was his farewell party. It was a lunch at Pierre, as you said. It was about 600 people in the ballroom there, mainly diplomats, senior UN officials, friends, but also this really eclectic group of celebrities and very prominent political personalities. It was funded by businessmen. It was funded by friends like Jackie Kennedy. It was funded by labor unions like the Amalgamated Laundry Workers of New York. And it shows you in those days that the labor unions in America were also extremely internationalist and really committed to the UN, for example. But the people who sent messages or who were there present in the room reading them were people like Edmund Hillary, who had climbed Mount Everest, Buckminster Fuller, Arnold Toynbee, the historian, Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, Jacques Cousteau, the underwater explorer. All these kinds of people were either there or sent messages, as well as heads of state and government from around the world. And U Thant gave a speech basically saying that, nationalism is fine, or being patriotic is fine, but we're at a point in human history where we really have to have this additional global consciousness and also have this loyalty to the planet as a whole and think in those terms. And many of those in the room committed themselves to being planetary citizens, and they declared U Thant planetary citizen number one. And so he was at the forefront, or I think he had made this long journey himself from being someone who represented a newly independent country to someone who had lived in New York for 15 years, worked in the UN, was Secretary General for a decade, and really felt very strongly that the world was at an inflection point, and this new planetary consciousness was more important than ever. And it was at that point that Pete Seeger, who was singing the songs, gave his guitar to John Lennon, who sang Imagine for the first time in America.
You've just transported us back there, so thank you very much. I noted that you quoted part of his speech, and at the very end of his speech, U Thant said, "We have to learn a great deal, but far more importantly, we have to unlearn a great deal. We have to unlearn a lot of dogma to get rid of that very bad concept of my country, right or wrong." So to close, what do you hope that we learn, that we unlearn, and that we do not forget?
Yeah, I think, we have to unlearn more or less not the same thing, but I think so many aspects of very deep-seated prejudices that I think are still around us and can easily be roused again and mobilized again. And I think we have to be aware of how fragile some of the progress that we've clearly made over the past many decades are in terms of creating a more just world. My worry is that we're also forgetting again, the horrible wars of the early 20th century and how important it is to have not just peace, but to make fashionable again the idea that we have to organize peace. It just doesn't happen by somebody parachuting in and doing a deal in the middle of a conflict. I think peace requires organization, it requires commitment, it requires skill, and it requires public mobilization as well. And I think that was understood by people left and right in many different countries in the 50s and 60s. And I think that's what we have to think about again in thinking about the future of the UN.
Thank you very much for reminding us. Thant Myint U, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Amy.